Greetings everyone. Thank you for coming today to our conference, Homeland, which can also be referred to as Urheimat, which is a term in historical linguistics. It is dedicated to the coming winter solstice, which will inaugurate on December 22nd. We organized this event in advance. We meet this event on the astronomical calendar. And today we are going to implement our old threefold dream and combine in one intellectual, actually semi-scientific effort today, three dimensions. First, mythological inquiry, already familiar to you, synergy of European think tanks and activists on the Ukrainian revolutionary platform, and which is a new component, the Indo-European studies. First of all, in the light of the discovery of the proto-Indo-European Homeland or Urheimat, to a great extent in the territory of modern Ukraine, in its southern region, to the north from the Black Sea. We opened this chapter not incidentally. This idea haunted us for a long time, and today we can see that we have only determined the main points of our interests in the course of the last several years, and we can say that musical subculture, as we know, have given us some hints, some orientations and maybe ideals even, but at the same time we have to admit that when it comes to Indo-European studies, apart from classics themselves, who will be discussed today, I mean George Dumézil, precisely new right authors were those who paid precise attention to the origin of diverse Indo-European peoples, who highlighted these origins and who also made it a basis for the new geopolitical models of European unity, the models of a new Imperium Europeanum. And that is why we are going to focus from now on this particular vector of research, because we see it as a ground for further development of our movement and like-minded people, our associates worldwide. Also, we have come to the conclusion that unfortunately some associations of the musical subculture created some obstacles for many guests who are going to attend Kyiv these days. In particular, they imposed travel limitations for them, and that is why we do not consider such association style and so on and so forth as a goal, as an end in itself. We consider it instrumental, and today we want to reach this next level of discussion and focus on the Indo-European studies and on the mythological level. After all, the goal of the musical subculture is to inspire us and to transform in the end into the counterculture. And it is also a task for us to also return the favor to the luminaries of this musical cultural field and to give them a scene not for a year or two because of our short-sighted approaches, which in the end appeal only to some edgy radical teens and nothing else. So that is a short preamble to signify the focus of our conferences, discussions, studies, which will start since today. Today's the first session of the Homeland or Urheimat conference. Many of you heard about the so-called Indo-Aryan migration theory and also about the linguistic similarity between the European, Iranian, Indian branches. In one of my previous speeches, maybe you heard it, the aristocracy of the spirit, I mentioned two founders of German Romanticism, brothers August and Friedrich Schlegel. August Schlegel was the first continental professor of Sanskrit and also translator of Bhagavad Gita. And his brother Friedrich, he also studied these matters. Both of them were pioneers of both Indo-Iranian studies and in linguistic and also ethnical studies connected to it. Friedrich Schlegel, actually, he considered the Urheimat not what has been discovered recently. I mean, the Pontic-Caspian steppes. He considered it to be India, but I started my short preamble with these facts. More or less recent genetical studies show that the true origin, proto-Indo-European Urheimat, was located precisely in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and the point of expansion in time, I mean, happened at around 4,000 years BC. So Schlegel considered it to be India, and he of course studied the notion Aryan also in philosophical terms. He considered it to be a synonym of something excellent, noble, honorable. He derived etymology of Aryan from the root Ari, which can be found both in Hindu text in Rig Veda and also in Iranian Zend Avesta, and he naturally paralleled it with the German notion honor. So that's why how he also considered his ancestors, our ancestors, I mean, European, heroic, warlike, and so on and so forth. And today we also found other confirmations of this hypothesis. We know that wheeled vehicles, in particular chariot, which played an important role in the development of military traditions of our ancestors, they happened here in this territory of these steppes. And that is indeed a unique situation for the modern European country, I mean Ukraine, because the entire southern part of our country is occupied by steppes. And it is, of course, was very convenient for the development of such vehicles and for the migration of the peoples. Actually, steppes, it has always been a frontier which separated us from the eastern and southern world. And proto-Ukrainian warriors, relative Cossacks, they have defended for centuries this frontier from different forms of invasion. I mean, Huns, Mongols, Tatars, different Eurasian tribes, and so on and so forth. So this land between the worlds still, I would say, bears this mission to a large extent. Actually, if you visit the archaeological museum not far from here, you will see there not only traces of this period, you can also find there even some artifacts connected to the half-legendary epoch of Cimmerians. You know about this legendary hero, Conan the Barbarian. So if we talk about this culture, which preceded Goths, Scythians, and Sarmatians, they also were located in the southern part of modern Ukraine. You can find many references to these different periods of Ukrainian history, and I'm really glad that today in our conference room are also present Ukrainian scientists who are scientifically preoccupied with the origins of the Slavs and the legacy of the Gothic tribes in Ukraine, in modern Ukraine. Study them archaeologically, professionally. So you can find references to what we know today as Rus, later Kievan Rus, in Old Norse sagas. For instance, in Icelandic sagas, they recall so-called Gardariki or Gardarika, which means the kingdom of the cities. Also, you can find there the mention of city Danparstad, city on the Dnipro River, or Dnieper River, which is the biggest river of Ukraine. Some mistakenly associated with Kyiv, but in fact it was the capital, or at least the city of the Gothic kingdom of Ermanaric, also Goth, Eastern Goth. Some sources claim that his kingdom was as huge that it expanded from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and even to the Ural Mountains in the east. It sounds unbelievable, but even we can find such mentions in antique sources too. Also, recent DNA researches conducted by Swedish scientists, they also proved this theory, this hypothesis. They found many similarities in the DNA data of modern Swedes and their ancestors, as well as people coming from southern Ukraine, which is quite interesting. It means that the normal hypothesis is inversed, but of course we talk about different time contexts. Anyway, the Goths came to Ukraine most probably from the Swedish island of Gotland, and later the western branch of Goths, they invaded Roman Empire and settled down in southern Gaul and in Hispania. and Ostrogoths were later conquered by Huns. But anyway, it's very interesting because the Gothic kingdom, 4th century, it was the first state formation in the territory of modern Ukraine, which connected Ukrainian mainland and Crimea, Crimean Peninsula, which is now occupied by Russia. It's also very interesting that Goths, they adopted Christianity quite early. It was very obscure form of Christianity. Maybe in some respects can be paralleled to Armenian, which has many like heathen traits in fact. And one of the early Gothic missionaries, Ulfilas, he translated the Bible to the so-called Gothic Bible. And of course it's quite also expected that Goths were oppressed later by some Muslim population in Crimea, and they still face these problems sometimes because Goths, they still remain, at least their heirs, descendants, they still remain in Crimea, which is very interesting. This peninsula is really a cradle and a point of intersections of many different peoples and tribes. Some of them are quite ancient. Later, we know that I talked about Cimmerians in 7th century BC. They were driven out of the steppes by Scythians. You know, Scythians and Sarmatians, they also succeeded each other. And we talk about these facts. We know the first, at least more or less reliable source is Herodotus, the father of history, Greek father of history. He mentions Goths, Scythians, and he also, in fact, separates what we call today as prehistory broadly from first antique period of history. And it's also quite interesting that he, as a Greek, visited city-state Olbia, which is a Greek polis, colony in the south of Ukraine, in modern Mykolaiv Oblast or region. I was also there, and it's also a part of our studies, not only theoretical, but also practical. I mean, seminars, field seminars of sacred geography, visiting different ancient landmarks from Neolithic period to later historical stages, heaven, landmarks, megaliths, everything which you can think about in this context, places of powers, so-called. And Olbia was also on the list of such spots. So I was there and studied all these ruins. It was very interesting, powerful, in fact, ancient city-state. Later it became the part of the Roman province, and then in the 4th century it fell along with the rest of the antique world after it was invaded by the Goths and Huns. Also last year there was quite an interesting event when our Lithuanian comrades brought 2,000 oaks, Lithuanian, to plant them in the island of Hortica. It's an ancient capital, Gothic capital, to plant them in honor of the fallen defenders of Ukraine. So we implemented this project. It was very interesting, and also conducted a seminar because Hortica also has many interesting places of power, so-called, including ancient caves, many heathen and neo-heathen spots. So I also recommend to you, if you happen to be in central Ukraine, Zaporizhia Oblast, to attend this part of our land. And potentially this particular field of study, I mean field seminars of sacred geography, places of power, and so on and so forth, it is open, of course, for neighboring countries, European countries in general, because we want to go deeper, we want to study what underlies our similarity, our European tribes, to feel this mysticism of our common cradle, and of course to make it a source of inspiration of our current activities. And since these conferences, it's not only, of course, mythological studies, not only musical parallels and stuff, but also a platform for the exchange of experience and strategies. As of now, I can say that we came to conclusion that the most suitable approach, which suits again our goals, is represented by the theories of the so-called third way, taken broadly, and new right, taken broadly. I explain why, because they pay particular attention in this context of our interest to Indo-European studies and origins, and they release us as people who act in a society from unnecessary associations which can put us on the level of these travel restrictions, which unfortunately we face today more and more often. So personally, I also strongly recommend to you, if you're engaged in kind of social activism, to adopt this kind of strategy, which has both a scientific level and also pragmatic importance for all of us. And everything else is your personal affair. You draw inspiration from what you want. It is not something which we are going to regulate here. So Today we would like to open this series of seminars, remembering our ancient origins and striving, of course, to draw some inspiration and conclusion from it for the future in the context of the archaeofuturistic worldview, which we also discussed a bit during the previous meetings. We know that also there was a big discovery in the archaeological studies when in the right bank Ukraine were found the excavations of the so-called Tripolian culture. It is not Indo-European, it is older, approximately 5,400 years BC. It is very interesting, but at the same time we can find there some artifacts and symbols which are common both for Indo-European cultures and for this older culture. We know that wheeled vehicles have already been present in the Tripolian culture, and also the ancient solar symbol, the swastika, which is present among every people of Indo-European origin. It was could also be found here. This culture, it existed from the Neolithic period to Bronze Age, but such solar symbols we can find already in the Paleolithic period in the territory of modern Ukraine. It's also quite interesting from the archaeological point of view. To conclude, today we associate this prehistoric period, which precedes the studies of the father of history, Herodotus, with myth, first of all, with mythological studies, with traditionalist studies. In this context, we remember the names, first of all, of René Guénon, Julius Evola, familiar to you, Mircea Eliade. Mircea Eliade, he was a scientist, so he, as opposed to Guénon and Evola, he didn't believe in the primordial tradition. He didn't discuss Hyperborea and its center Thule and the polar origin of mankind as Guénon and Evola. No, he focused on the myth of the eternal recurrence and studied different empirical data connected to various tribes, from Australian to Iranian and so on and so forth. But all of them, of course, are interested in this connection between myth and historical existence. And personally, I studied the legacy as a historian of philosophy of the person who is also closely related to this milieu, I mean Ernst Jünger. It is quite interesting that this person actually combines in his legacy different vectors of our discussion. Today, when we announced this conference, we mentioned mythology, sacred geography, Indo-European studies, ecology. And in his work, At the Wall of Time, it's a philosophical work, almost historiosophic, he discusses the concept of meta-history. So, in his opinion, now we faced the developments of technological civilization, which have led to the so-called exit from history. So, just like Herodotus was talking about the transition from the mythos to logos, from the myth to history, now we also face a transition from the historical existence, anthropocentric existence, to something new, something unknown. It's not a cyclic concept of history, it's something different, but still it contains many valuable also empirical observations. And it's very interesting that in this book, Jünger also differentiates between the so-called Stone Age, mythological Golden Age, mythological age as such, which is Bronze Age, and our current Iron Age. And so we can also discuss these matters, which of course is not a subject of strict scientific research. We can also differentiate between the oldest sources which reached us and which we describe in terms of fairy tales, legends, from the myth as such. And then we discuss, of course, historical sources, what can be called a reliable source of information. And in my opinion, it is quite interesting that we have several dimensions, not only myth and history, but also pre-mythological times, mythological times, and all of them, of course, are discussed in a non-linear terms. They have their special mode of existence. It is not something which follows one after another. They're connected in the so-called kairotic respect. You know, this concept of kairos, it was also discussed by different theologians, Christian, non-Christian terms. Christians talked about the messianic time, it's like the eternity which reveals in the historical time, and we feel it's an evolution, it is something higher, it is something which radically changes our earthly existence. Non-Christian, like Heidegger discussed kairos also as a point of higher historical decision, something also which completely changes our like mundane existence. It's very interesting. So these different temporal time modes, they are related to each other in this like chaotic respect. And today, when we face these cracks in history, revolution in Ukraine, downfall of the myth of the end of history, again huge catastrophes which show the fragility of man on Earth. In the view of these observations, I agree with Hermann Hesse, who wrote a very interesting review of this book by Junger, that indeed we can feel this downfall of the anthropocentric, human-centric history. Junger discussed it in the terms of this geological revolution, titanic revolution. He talked about the mythological figure of Antaeus, neither god nor titan, the son of Earth, who draws strength from Gaia, from Earth, and who fulfills her like rebellion against the Uranus. And the traits, like signs, external signs of this rebellion can be seen in the destruction of borders, in the development of genetic engineering, in the this revolt against patriarchal orders, against artificial insemination, and so on and so forth, decrease of the species, different types of plants, animals. So it's a kind of like new revolution which decreases natural diversity. We can feel it also. We can discuss also in terms of globalization. But Junger was like a kind of philosophical optimist. For him, it was just a phase of this like earthly rebellion, mythological against the Uranus, after which will start a new era in meta-history. It will be not a continuation of history, it will be something new. It won't be the myth, it won't be something else, it won't be a return to like ordinary historical existence as in medieval times, for instance. No, or in new modern times. It will be another part of history which is quite interesting for us as intellectuals, not only those who can be specialists in narrow fields, but only for those who would like to try to predict the future based on what we experience now. Say 2 world wars, global ecological catastrophes, creation of this, on the first hand, liberal state, but on the other hand, we can see that it is very regulated, in fact, neo-totalitarian world state. So we want to give proper assessment to all of these phenomena in the light, in the perspective of proper intellectual background, which includes these meta-historical studies on the intersection of traditionalist studies and history and philosophy, and mythological studies, Indo-European studies, ecological studies. And also interesting that Junger influenced so-called trend of geophilosophy in Italy. Massimo Cacciari, Luisa Bonesio, Caterina Resta, the mayor of Venice in 1995, he invited Junger to talk about these matters, and it was also founded by controversy. It is very interesting that the Greens, those who, this popular trend today, ecological parties, they were against it because they considered Junger to be, of course, right-wing intellectual, and so on and so forth. But anyway, he gave a huge impetus to these ecological studies, which we will also discuss today. So now I will finish. It was again a long welcome word. We will proceed now in a quite dynamic regime, and I outlined this horizon of further researchers, summarized them partially in Ernst Junger's legacy, quite interesting. It's also worth to mention that he and Mircea Eliade launched a journal, Antaeus. It lasted. It was published from 1959 to 1971. Very interesting, big volumes, mythological studies, esoterical studies, symbolism, and so on and so forth. So if you ever encounter it, I highly recommend this. It is directly connected to what we are doing here. But I also promise that next editions of Homeland Seminar can be held also in quite a narrow scientific format. That's why I mentioned that today we were graced by the presence of several Ukrainian academics who work with Gothic legacy in Ukraine and the origin of the Slavs. And now I would like to invite Eugen Ryadnik to talk about modern archaeofuturism. What we mean by it, he will explain to you. New neo-tribalism in the context of these cracks in the history and in this global state, which we perceive today, Ukrainian revolution, what we're doing here and what is the horizon of our activities. So now he will cover the section of synergy of think tanks and activism on the Ukrainian revolutionary platform.
Да, пожалуйста, можно без камеры записи, потому что мне хочется более-менее свободно говорить.
I will translate him passage by passage.
Так, с чего бы хотелось начать?